All right, excellent. Well, thanks everyone for being here. Good morning. My name is Jonathan Lewallen. I'm from the University of Texas down in Austin. And I'm going to talk about congressional dysfunction and the decline of problem solving. This is a project that Sean Theriault, Brian Jones, and I have been working on for a little while now, and so I look forward to any comments you all have about this project as we move on to the next phase of the research. And I want to start off by giving a brief preview of the talk today. First, we have numerous recent examples of dysfunction in Congress and a breakdown in the institution's ability to solve public problems and govern in a lot of different ways. And in this project, we take a look at this kind of congressional dysfunction as an information problem. That something has changed in the way that committees are holding hearings and processing information for the institution, which then filters back, feeds into the partisan war, affects what the chamber as a whole is doing. And to get at this, we have a new way of coding congressional hearings. We have two different dimensions that I'm going to talk about shortly. But from these data, I'm going to show some trends in hearing activity since 1971, and then use those data to analyze the role that these changes in congressional information processing are playing in dysfunction. So we'll start off with something that's likely familiar to most, if not all, of the folks in this room. This is a graph of party polarization in Congress over time. And of course, beginning in the 1950s, you see this steep climb. Along with this trend, we've seen accusations of do-nothing Congress, dysfunction in both chambers, right? This idea that there's a broken branch, right, the title of this panel. And a lot of political scientists, journalists, politicians make this a direct connection, right? So this question of, are committed ideologues making governing impossible? The idea that the two parties are more ideologically distinct than they ever have been, and therefore governing is just going to be a little more intractable, or a lot more intractable in some cases. We think we can dig a little bit deeper into this relationship, but to do so, we first need to sort of understand and define what we mean by dysfunction. And in this paper, we define dysfunction as breakdowns in the institution's ability to solve problems in a broad sense, but then in two specific areas. The first is brinkmanship deal-making, which is waiting for deadlines to come up or even pass and program funding to expire before Congress acts. And of course, we've had a lot of programs and agencies like the Federal Aviation Administration face this kind of thing, and of course the government shutdown a couple of years ago is really the prime example of this. And then the other is stopgap lawmaking, where Congress just enacts short-term fixes repeatedly rather than adopt some kind of long-term solution that takes an issue off of the table for a longer period of time. So if you think to the debt ceiling and what are the big to-do about that a couple of years ago, the agreement that they come up with was basically that they're just going to keep addressing it every 8 months or so, rather than do something to take it off the table for a longer period of time, which means then it just keeps coming up on the agenda, pushes other things out of the way, and creates this partisan warfare, this partisan dysfunction. And we think we can dig a little bit deeper into this relationship between, or into this phenomenon, because when we think back to 1950 and the American Political Science Association's report on parties in the US political system, they were calling for stronger, more cohesive parties, not just in the electorate, but in Congress. And in fact, a lot of the changes that the APSA recommended in 1950 were put in place. And so the parties that we have in Congress today really align pretty closely with what the APSA recommended we have. And so if this idea of responsible party government is considered a net benefit, then maybe there's something else going on here other than the fact that the two parties are presenting these distinct agendas. And in fact, in the course of this project, we take the view that a lot of this dysfunction is really an information problem. That the committees are, the way that they're holding hearings has changed, that they're taking in less information, they're taking in different kinds of information that's then feeding back and contributing to these breakdowns in problem solving. So that a lot of the factors that we associate with polarization and these ideologically distinct parties, competitive elections, uncertainty about which party is going to be in the majority in the future that leads to this partisan warfare, they may have a direct effect on congressional dysfunction, but they're also filtering in through the committee system and creating this environment where committee members really have fewer incentives to become legislative workhorses, which then affects what the chamber is doing as a whole. And I mentioned at the beginning that we have two different dimensions that we're coding for congressional hearings. The first of these is a hearing's purpose. So we go into a little more detail in the paper on this, but I'm just going to sort of give the broad strokes here. The first dimension, the purpose dimension, is whether a hearing is devoted to a policy problem that the government really isn't paying much attention to, or at least Congress isn't paying much attention to at a given point in time. It's policy implementation, so how the bureaucracy is carrying out current policy, or a policy solution, a proposed solution hasn't been adopted yet, hasn't been enacted yet, but is on the table for consideration. And then the other dimension is the hearing stance, so how exploratory or positional it is. Positional in this sense means that it's just one-sided, the committee's only hearing one perspective, so it might be 8 witnesses who all agree that the Small Business Administration is doing a great job, and there's no one there to say, well, you know, we've had some problems. Or a series of witnesses who all agree that childhood obesity is something that the federal government should pay attention to, without anyone saying, well, you know, maybe this isn't a function of government, that's really our responsibility. Exploratory then, on the other hand, would be hearing from multiple perspectives, both sides of the debate, or it could be purely an analytical exchange, so bringing in the GAO or the CRS just to understand the policy issue that they're about to address. So what is fracking? Like, I don't even know what that is. Please tell me, so that then if we're going to enact a law or if we're going to oversee the bureaucracy making rules on this thing, we actually know what we're doing. In the course of this project, we've also been collecting data on hearing witnesses and witness panels to get at the kind of scope of information that committees are taking in these hearings. So how many people are they talking to when they're addressing a given issue? We've sampled different committees, and so this isn't the full range of committee activity, but from 1971 to 2008, we've coded about 15,500 hearings. So we think it's a pretty good representative sample. We pick the committees based on their issue jurisdictions, on a host of factors, so we think we have a pretty good broad base to work from here. And over the course of this time period, again 1971 to 2008, committees are hearing from about 12 witnesses on average in a given hearing over the course of 4 panels. Then if we look at the purpose dimension, about half of all of these hearings are on proposed solutions, legislative or otherwise, and then the rest break down pretty evenly between problems and implementation. Although you can see in the House, it's geared a little more towards the implementation side of things. And then on the stance dimension, about 70% of all of the hearings in this data set are considered exploratory. That is, they're taking multiple points of view, multiple sides of the debate, or they're just getting analysis and information. So this gives us a really good cross-section of sort of what committees have been doing over the last 3 or 4 decades. But of course, we're interested in how these numbers have changed over time. If we're going to say something about changes in the way that Congress as an institution is governing and then solving problems, we need to say something about changes to what the committees are doing. So I'm going to start by showing you a trend in the average number of witness panels. The witnesses data look almost exactly like this. I just left them off for space reasons. But we can see that there's been a pretty linear decline over time. So in the early 1970s, both House and Senate committees were hearing from about 6 or 7 witness panels in a given hearing on average. And when you get into the late 2000s, it goes down to about 2 panels on average. If you look at the purpose dimension, again, a pretty linear decline. In the early 1970s, about 70% of House and Senate hearings were devoted to proposed solutions. So a bill that's on the table or a proposed rule or something like that. If you get into the late 2000s, that drops to about 30 to 35% of all hearings are focused on these proposed solutions. And as these have declined, House and Senate committees are holding more hearings on both problems and on implementation. So there's not one or the other that's taking the place, they're filling in the gaps with both of these kinds of hearings. And you can see that there aren't very many interchamber differences in these trends, that both the House and the Senate are sort of following each other on these things. That's not the case when we look at the stance dimension. So you can see the Senate trend line here is pretty flat. There actually is a very small increase, it's just hard to pick out here. But on the other hand, the House is showing a pretty clear increase in the percentage of positional hearings that committees are holding over time. Again, from about 25 to 30% in the early 70s up to closer to 35% today. We can break down the hearings a little further and look at the stance dimension by purpose, so what percentage of solution hearings, for example, are exploratory or positional. Here we break them out by chamber in each graph, and you can see that in each chamber, it's this darker trend line here, in each chamber, problem-focused hearings are becoming more positional. You see the same trend for implementation hearings in the House, not so much in the Senate, but at least these hearings that are devoted to learning or in this case, advocating for a new issue to reach the agenda, the percentage of those hearings is increasing over time. So now we have a good sense of what's been changing among committees. We need to now situate that into our story of congressional dysfunction and these breakdowns in problem solving. And the first set of relationships, as I mentioned earlier, is this idea that the factors we associate with polarization and stronger parties, again, competitive elections and partisan warfare, are leading to changes in the way that committees are going about their business and processing information. And so these information processing variables are going to be our dependent variables in the first stage of analysis. And so we run a series of regression models. The dependent variables, again, are the number of witness panels, the number of witnesses, the percentage of hearings devoted to solutions, and the percentage of hearings that are positional. And for our independent variables, we have measures of party strength, or party leader strength, I should say, electoral competition between the two parties, partisan warfare, and then we also include measures for the growth in government activity to control for maybe a change in demand for what committees are doing. I have a regression table I can show you if there are questions and if you'd like, but to cut to the chase here, we've seen fewer solution hearings as the party leaders have grown stronger, as they've gained more multiple referral power. Fewer committees are then holding hearings on proposed solutions. We've also seen fewer witnesses in Senate hearings for committees that have more Gingrich senators. So these are, Sean Theriault has explained to us, these are the senators who are coming over from the House, bringing that atmosphere of partisan warfare to the upper chamber. When more of these senators get together on a given committee, that committee then restricts the kind of information it's bringing in through its witnesses. Excuse me. And then we've also seen fewer House hearing panels and witnesses as the government has grown. As government activity has increased, these committees are, again, restricting the kind of information they're bringing in. We don't have any significant results in these models for the percentage of hearings that are positional, so there's some more work to be done there. But I think we can then move to the next stage of analysis, which is now understanding how these changes to information processing are contributing to congressional dysfunction, these breakdowns in problem solving. So the dependent variables in our previous analysis are now our independent variables. So the average number of panels, the solution percentage, the positional percentage. We leave out the witness data here because they're so highly correlated with the panels. We played around with the data a little bit. The models with the panel variable perform a little bit better, so that's why I'm showing you these. Our dependent variable here refers back to our definition of dysfunction. So we have some models where the dependent variable is the number of continuing appropriations resolutions enacted in a given Congress, to refer to that kind of stopgap lawmaking where they're just funding an agency at last year's levels until they can come up with something else. And then a binary indicator for whether a chamber had to call a lame duck session, so waiting until the very last possible minute to actually get something done. Again, I have regression tables at the end I'm happy to show if there are questions, but from our results, what we find is that Congress is enacting more continuing resolutions as House committees are hearing from fewer panels on average, and as Senate committees spend less time learning about proposed policy solutions. We're also seeing lame duck sessions in the House become more likely as those committees are hearing from fewer panels on average. So we really are seeing this relationship between changes to information processing and congressional dysfunction, at least in the measures that we're using here. I don't know that I have time to go into this recent example of the human trafficking bill in the Senate. Well, 5 minutes, I might be able to do it. So there's a human trafficking bill that came to the Senate floor. This was to curtail human trafficking abroad and using federal funding to do so. And Democrats discovered a provision in this bill that would sort of expand the scope of the Hyde Amendment. The Hyde Amendment restricts or limits, prevents, I guess, federal funding from being used to support abortion and, depending on how you define it, other kind of family planning services in other countries. This human trafficking bill would expand that use into this area. Democrats didn't like that, and so they started filibustering the bill. What's interesting is if you go back and look at the committee hearing on this bill, it tracks very closely to the averages that I showed you earlier. There were about 4 panels, about 12 witnesses. Everyone loved this bill. Everyone loved this issue. They thought Congress should address this, including 2 Democratic senators, Barbara Mikulski and Kirsten Gillibrand, who were witnesses in this hearing. No one noticed this provision. No one commented on this provision. It was sort of a rah-rah, yes, this is something that we need to get involved in. Of course, we don't necessarily expect that Senate committees will search high and low for folks who don't think that we should stop human trafficking, that no, we can let this go, this is fine. But at the very least, I think we could pretty easily fit this hearing into that problem positional category. Everyone thought, yes, this is great. It was basically a one-sided hearing. No one was providing multiple perspectives on this thing. And as a result, this provision wasn't discovered until much later, and we got a filibuster. We got a pretty prime example of congressional dysfunction. This is something that no one really disagrees with. But we saw that the committee information processing broke down clearly if Democrats were surprised by this provision. And so to conclude, we think that information processing plays a big part of this congressional dysfunction story. That when you look at what committee hearings are doing today compared to 1970, the scope of information that they're taking in has become more restricted. They're hearing from fewer witnesses and fewer witness panels. Hearings are less likely to focus on proposed policy solutions, legislative or otherwise, and they're more likely to hear from one side of a given debate. And these trends are partly consequences of stronger parties in the government and partisan warfare, but then they feed back into this partisan war, and they contribute to dysfunction, to stopgap lawmaking, to brinkmanship, and really to breakdowns in the institution's ability to solve problems. We do need to do a little more work to sort through these relationships. It's a knotty tangle here, but we think this is a really fruitful area, and we're really encouraged by what we found so far. And again, I look forward to any comments and questions you all have.
Thank you.